My name is Erin Tinnen with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and we're so excited that you've decided to join our webinar today. Today's webinar, Reflective Conversations, is presented by Terry Peace with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and hosted by the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details today of the WebEx software that we're going to be using for today's webinar. Many of these details will also be explained in the Using this WebEx System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen. Please be aware that your screen might look a little bit different depending on if you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You can contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To demonstrate, you can just click the down-facing arrow and select whom you'd like to get into contact with. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, we're going to want you to use the All Participants option if you want to respond to a question from the trainer or to contact me anytime during the session. You can click on Jennifer Curley privately to contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Can everyone please go into the chat box, click on All Participants, and type in the program you're calling from, and then press Enter? Excellent. Perfect. Action Alliance, Laurel Center, Crisis Center, perfect. So folks can go ahead and continue to do that. At the end of the webinar, you're going to be taken to a very brief evaluation. And if you could let us know what was useful and what could have been better, that would be great. If you get disconnected, you can return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training that way. Or if you're experiencing additional technical difficulties or are unable to connect, unable to contact Jen Curley, you can call the WebEx tech system to resolve any issues. That phone number is 1-866-229-3239, and we'll paste that in the chat feature as well. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Kate.
Thanks, Erin. This is Kate McCord from the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. I'm the Communications Director here, and I wanted to welcome everyone to the training. I also wanted to thank folks who responded to our survey about what you were looking for in a webinar about providing trauma-informed services. We found that very helpful in planning this together. We're excited to be able to offer this webinar in our attempts to promote trauma-informed practice in Virginia. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Terry Peace, who has extensive experience as a trauma specialist, trainer, and educator. She's devoted much of her work to addressing sexual assault and domestic violence trauma and abuse of people with disabilities and in communities of color. She's been especially interested in the intersections of domestic violence, trauma, and mental health, and building collaborations between victim service providers and mental health disability service providers to better serve the needs of trauma survivors. We've had a lot of fun planning these webinars with Terry. She has numerous recognitions for her extraordinary work, and we've discovered that she is a brilliant trainer and brilliant thinker and has an extraordinary ability to take what can seem to be a daunting task of providing and talking about trauma-informed services and breaking it down into practical solutions that help us serve survivors better. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Terry Peace. Terry?
Kate, thank you. And I think, can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
You're good, Terry.
Oh, okay, great. Hi. I am so glad to be here again this afternoon. And Kate, thank you for that nice introduction. That's a lot to live up to. And I'm envying all of you who were down in Virginia. When we were getting ready for the call, I had to go upstairs and get a space heater and an Afghan. It's so cold here in Maine. So enjoy your warm weather down there. And I'm really glad that we're going to have an hour and a half to spend together today talking about how to make this business of trauma-informed practice real and what are things that we can actually do. And so my goal for our work together today, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail, but my goal today is to help you walk away with some specific things you can do that will make you think, oh, okay, now I have some steps to take. But it's always helpful to me, in addition to the great answers that we got from your survey that was sent out from the Action Alliance, to ask those of you who are on the call to tell me what will make this webinar worthwhile for you in terms of your work in trauma-informed practice. What is it that you're hoping for? And I think there's a little bit of a time lag between when you type and when it's actually seen by the rest of us. So lacking any Jeopardy music to play in the background, we'll just keep talking and take a look at the things that you suggest about what will make this useful for you. And in general, in terms of a webinar like this, I like to make it more of a working session than just my being a talking head. An hour and a half of me babbling on and on is not going to be as helpful as if we're working together to think, all right, what do we actually do with this to make it make sense? So I'm hoping that you will raise questions, and especially the sort of question that says, well, I'm not sure this is right, but this might be what I think. Because really that's the way we start to learn and explore and kind of test and taste our thoughts. So please feel free to do that, even if you're not sure that it's exactly what you think. Let's throw it out there and we can all work at it together. So please feel free to do that. And if you have questions that you'd like to interrupt and ask, if you put it into the chat, if I don't see it, Jen is really great at reminding me in the speaker channel on this to take a look at a question that came that may have gone past me. So welcome again, and I see that there are about 24 people on. Some of you, I'm guessing, have more than one person in the room. So there are enough of us that we really should be able to get some good ideas going and some good thinking going. One thing I was impressed about at looking at the survey and also in the conversations with Kate and the other staff from the Action Alliance is that you guys have been thinking about trauma and understanding trauma so that this is not an introductory conversation. I will take a couple minutes to tell you a model of thinking about trauma that I hope will be helpful to funnel our thoughts into a particular direction in terms of what do we actually do in practice. But I'm not going to be doing this as a Trauma 101. I'm pretty sure most of, if not all of you, have already had that. I do like to start with drawing on the thinking of Maxine Harris and Roger Fallett, who almost 15 years ago gave us the phrase trauma-informed services. And I think it's a really good place to start because, you know, we could set up a program that was intended for trauma survivors, and that would be trauma-defined services. We could set up a program or bring expertise that was about healing the impact of trauma, healing nightmares or fears or other kinds of physical or emotional or psychological reactions to trauma, which would be trauma-specific treatment or trauma-specific intervention. But trauma-informed services is something different still. And what I mean by trauma-informed services, what Maxine Harris and Roger Fallett meant was that all of us in an organization start with the understanding that people who walk through our doors have most likely experienced trauma. And that's not only true of our work, of course. Trauma's everywhere, so that even if we worked in a fast food restaurant or a grocery store, we would be encountering trauma survivors. And so we're not going to be surprised at the people who come through our doors asking for the kinds of services, looking for the kinds of services that we offer for survivors of sexual and domestic violence will be people who are experiencing trauma. It's not unexpected. And that means if we know that it's there, we know it affects people, and then we have to ask, how do we do whatever job we do in a way that is responsive to the reality of trauma and harm in people's lives? An example that I use that I think helps to shape that whole question in terms of both incorporating trauma and minimizing further traumatization comes from a training session that I was invited to do at this is not a DV or sexual violence program. This is a child welfare organization in another part of the country. And they invited me, and so I was sort of the bigwig coming for this training. And it was, you know, I walked in the door, and it was, oh, Dr. Pease, we're so happy to see you. And the person who's going to meet you is going to be right down. Please have a seat. Would you like a cup of tea? That kind of welcome that made me feel like, oh, all right, I belong here. They're glad I'm here. While I was sitting there in the waiting room reading a magazine and waiting to be met, a mother and kids came in the door. The same woman, sitting behind the same desk, spoke to this woman and her children as in, yeah, what do you want? I'll see if she's here. wait over there. Same woman, but treating the survivor and her children, the presumed survivor and her children, very, very differently. And so in some ways not beginning the process of saying the world has safe places, but instead furthering that person's experience, whoever she was, furthering her experience of there are places in the world where I'm not sure I'm safe and welcome. So part of being trauma-informed at the very beginning is being responsive to the reality of harm in the lives of anyone who walks through our doors and making sure that every way that we encounter and interact with people is responsive to that. Carol Warshaw, who's the director of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, says something that I've always thought was really, really smart about our work, which is that, and Carol says a lot of smart things, but this particular thing that she says is that trauma that happens in the context of relationships, human-engendered trauma, is healed in the context of relationships. And that's why we don't heal people just by giving them guidebooks and websites and information packets, but it is how we are with people that starts the process of responding to the trauma in their lives and providing them with something different that facilitates their healing and increases their sense of resilience and well-being. Now, the last point on this slide, which really is, I think, a critical thing that we learned from Maxine and Roger, is that our trauma-informed work has to not only focus on the fact that trauma is real in the lives of survivors who come to us looking for our expertise and our services and our support. It's also happened to us. We know that in any group of 100 people, 20%, 30%, 40%, depending on what kind of trauma and how you define it, will have experienced some sort of significant interpersonal trauma themselves, which means that we all come to this work as people affected by trauma. And we come to this work, many of us, direct survivors of sexual and domestic violence. So we have to be aware that being trauma-informed is not only what we as advocates do in our work with survivors, but how we are with each other and how those of us who are managers and supervisors are in the way that we lead and manage and support organizations. So we're starting, and you in Virginia, I should say, are starting to look at what's the next step from understanding that trauma happens to knowing how to be trauma responsive and trauma informed in all of what we do. So let's start with a way of thinking about trauma, and I'd just like to look very quickly at a definition that's probably familiar to you, which is that it's an individual's unique experience, so that we don't define trauma by saying, well, let's see, getting hit is traumatizing and getting scowled at is not traumatizing, because it's not the nature of the offense that determines whether something is traumatizing or not. It's the nature of the experience of the event. So that for me, someone scowling at me and calling me a name might unsettle me in a way that it doesn't bother you, or the other way around. So it's an individual person's individual experience of an event or a condition, which first of all feels like it's a threat to the person's survival or a threat to the survival of someone they love. And that it's accompanied by feelings of shock or terror or fear. And this last point, I think, is the most important one, which is that the coping capacity of the person is not adequate to roll with the punches, restore balance, or integrate the experience that's happened. Which is why for one of us, a particular event might not be that traumatizing, whereas a similar or same event in someone else's life might have traumatizing effects. So I hope you'll hold on to that as we move on to thinking about the work that we're going to be doing together and thinking about how we're actually trauma-informed in our day-to-day interactions with people. All trauma originates in stressing situations and environments. And if we think about the definition of stress or the nature of stress, stress is anything that says, go back to balance. You're off balance slightly. You're moved away from your ordinary equilibrium. You've got to do something to get back to it. A simple example is I was sitting here in my living room ready for this webinar, and I started to feel really chilly. So that's a stress. It's not traumatizing, but it was a stress. So what did I do? I thought about what are the resources in my life for getting warm. Should I turn on the furnace or should I go upstairs for a space heater and an Afghan? I found what I needed to do to get back into balance to a comfortable state. I was shifted away from balance and I had the resources to restore balance. Okay? But not all, there's stress, but then there's also traumatizing stress or traumatic stress, and it's important to understand this distinction. Traumatic stress is stress that shifts people away from balance, safety, stability, predictability to a degree that that person's resources are not sufficient to get back on balance, to get back to equilibrium on their own with what they have. And that varies from person to person. I like to use this illustration to get us thinking about that because it helps us recognize something really important about trauma-informed services. Take a look at this lady. I always enjoy looking at her. And what I want to start is by asking you, what's going on here and what do you think will happen in the next 5 seconds? What could happen in the next 5 seconds? So I'd love to have just some of you type in what are some possibilities of what might happen in the next 5 seconds. She might fall. Absolutely. She's there in thin air, and she might, in midair, and she might fall. What else might happen? I hope somebody says she might not fall. So she might fall. She might not fall. She might, just land on her wheel. She might do awesome kick flips. Somebody actually knows something about skateboarding. She might land on her feet. She might jump off the skateboard. She might go skating off into the distance, or any number of other things might happen. And my question is, we can't tell when we see someone who walks, who presents themselves in front of us in a state of unbalance, a state of disequilibrium. We can't predict what's going to happen next just by what we see in this moment. What do we need to, what else will tell us and what will determine what happens to our skateboarder? Whether she does kick flips or lands on her feet or falls on her knees or something else. What are the various factors that could make a difference? Her past experience with skateboarding, of course. Is this her first time on a skateboard or not? What else might make a difference? How stable she is. How good is her balance? How she reacts when she hits the ground. Now, what's going to determine how she reacts? Her surroundings. For example, are there people all around her laughing and pointing, ha ha, you don't know what you're doing? Or are there people all around her saying, go girl, you've got it, her skill set? Lots of things about her, her experience, her past. How long has she been on that skateboard? Is this the 3rd hour that she's been practicing, or did she just get on the skateboard? The shoes she's wearing might make a difference. I don't know that I would skateboard in heels, but it might also be other things than just what we see. For example, what if she lands on smooth, beautifully banked pavement? All those other things you've just mentioned, if she lands in a very smooth environment, it's going to be much easier for her to get back on balance. Or if she lands on wet sand, all the skill in the world, it's going to take a great deal more skill for her to stay on balance in that environment. But it's not only that. It could also be the condition of the skateboard, right? What if one of the wheels has been loosened by somebody who's out to harm her? What if the skateboard has just gotten really beaten up from time after time after time of having to manage, of having to get back to balance? I use this example to ask you to think about how when we work with survivors of sexual violence or domestic violence, there's no predicting based just on the facts of the situation, how well or how easy or difficult it's going to be for a person to restore themselves to what equilibrium looks like for them. And it's also important to know that equilibrium for one skateboarder, for one survivor, might be very different than for another survivor, depending on what her past life has been like, her expectations, the expectations around her of what she has to do. If she has one child as opposed to having 6 children, then what it's going to take to be on balance is going to be very different. And what this means is that we can't just draw on what's in our heads and in our knowledge and our past experience to anticipate what the survivor in front of us is going to need. We have to be able to work together with her to get there. So I hope you'll hold on to that thought as we move on. because I want to talk about what it is that we're going to do today as we think about how to build conversations and connections with survivors that help us to be responsive to them, to help us, to help them get to a place where they can make their next best step in the work. I'm going to talk about what is reflective, strengths-based, trauma-informed practice and give you some ideas about what that looks like. Talk a little bit about why do it, why not do something different, and then how are reflective conversations a tool for that, getting us going on that path. So that's my purpose for our work together today. I also think it's really important to say this, because sometimes when we think about working with people who are trauma survivors, we think that it's our job to heal the impact of trauma. And if you are a licensed therapist or a licensed counselor, that may be your job, and that may be why a survivor is coming to you. If I went to a therapist to deal with the fact that I don't sleep well because of the trauma experiences in my past, then that's trauma treatment. But that's not what we do typically as advocates in domestic or sexual violence work. So it's important to know that it's not our job to make trauma reactions that are based in a person's long history or more recent history go away. It's also that our work today is not about getting survivors to tell their trauma stories. I know that, it's partly TV, partly our own inclination, that we think that part of what we need to do is to get people to tell us what happened to them. Sometimes that telling is an important part of the work that they want to do. Sometimes there are aspects of that that are important for our work if we are working in court advocacy. There may be things that we have to get down, facts that we have to get in order to move forward with things like a court advocacy case. But getting a survivor to tell her trauma story should not, as a general rule, be central to our work with the survivor. And our work today is also not about a rigid set of steps to use. Although I'm going to be showing you a couple of conversation guides, they're meant to be a first step towards moving toward working in a trauma-informed and reflective way. So with those kind of caveats, let's move forward to thinking about what do we actually want to do when we're doing advocacy. And I like to use these graphics to help us think about it. Think about your own experience in some workplace that you've had in the past. Have you ever been in a workplace like this where you, as the person climbing up towards your work goals, are being dragged up, called up, urged up by a leader, a manager, a supervisor? It's one way to work as an employee, and if you are working with a survivor, have you had this experience in your work with survivors, that you feel like you're reaching out to her and saying, come on, you can do it, let's go up the step, let's go that way towards that goal? Many of us have had that experience of being the way that we've worked. What's it like when you're working with a survivor in that way, and you've got the idea of a direction to go, and you're reaching your hand out and hoping you can pull her up? How does that go? How does it feel? And I'm, again, looking for my da-da-da-da. It is frustrating, exhausting. It can wear you out to be that person reaching out and calling and hoping that you can get somebody to move up. It's unsteadying. It leaves you feeling unsure of yourself. Absolutely. I think there are other ways that may be better, although this often is the kind of work. But yes, but we also can be very hopeful, and obviously this model comes out of our hope that we can help someone get to a better place, because very often we have a vision. I can see how she could finish school, get a better apartment, get her kids into a safe school, stay away from her batterer, find a way to get the conviction that is justice calls for with a perpetrator. And we can see that vision, and we have the hope of making that happen, of helping that happen. Sometimes, have you ever worked with survivors where you felt that you were the person with the megaphone and showing her hoops to jump through, whether they're service goals or requirements in order to be able to get an entitlement, to get TANF or something of the sort? Have you had that experience? Yes, where you're asking people, do this, now do that, now do that. It's not much fun to be in that position. And what do you think it feels like for the folks who are jumping through those hoops? I'm sure the survivors that you've worked with have told you what it's like to feel like they're having to jump through hoops. What do I have to do? What do I have to do? Who's in charge here? And it's not empowering. And yet sometimes, I wish our funders could hear more that sometimes we end up with so many requirements that funding and legislation and programs set to us that we can get caught in this kind of relationship with survivors. And it too is exhausting. Survivors don't feel in control. Survivors feel exhausted, and it's not their vision. Something I try to remember and try to remind people about is that any person you're working with, whether she's gotten to your door rolling up in her wheelchair or just barely staggering up your steps, she's gotten there. She's still breathing, which means that on her own, without you, this is a grown person. And you may work with children, so it may be a family, but on their own, this is a person who's doing something in her life and hasn't given up entirely and still has her own vision about what is the one next best step. It may not be this one that we are so sure about and so clear about, or that our funders have told us, this is the ladder you have to climb. But she comes, or he comes, I'm talking as though all survivors are women, and of course we know that's not true. But the survivor who comes to the door with their own vision of their next best step, as I've said, is the person, that's the place that you can begin. And the model that I think is the most, for me, the most exciting way of thinking about working with people is to realize that there are two people or more reaching together for stars that you have individually and jointly defined. Each survivor has a vision of what's the next best thing. And sometimes, I think again about a particular domestic violence service shelter where I worked years and years ago, where it was very clear that the next best thing for survivors often was to get 2 nights of uninterrupted sleep without having to look over your shoulder. And that's an appropriate goal. It's not the only goal, but if we join with the survivors with whom we work to say the first thing is just to be able to sit still for a moment without feeling terrified, and that might be an appropriate starting place. You know, and it's important to recognize as we talk about this that, yes, when we work with survivors, and sometimes people even use this graphic and sit down with survivors with whom they work and say, okay, let's think about what stars are you reaching for today? What stars can I help you reach? And to also realize that you have stars too. And if you have to get a particular form filled out in order to feel like you can do the next step, that's an appropriate goal. But what I would say to us as advocates is that the way we name that is, you know, part of what I'm asked to do when I meet with a new survivor is to make sure that we get these forms filled out because they help our funders keep our money flowing. And so I'm going to ask you to help me fill out my form. It's a hugely different message than you need to fill this out before we can move forward. Right? The form is mine as the advocate or as the agency, as a program. And we ask her to help us with that. So again, you can't tell from this picture which person is in charge, in control. You each have goals. And we're talking about a relationship between two empowered people with different roles, responsibilities, and experiences. Now, moving on from this thought, and I hope you kind of let that percolate in the back of your mind as well, I want you to think about the fact that the things that we know how to do well in this work are not the places where we struggle. When you know how to do something well and it's like clockwork and it always goes really well, that's not where you really have to put your mental effort, your mental energy. What happens is that as we do this work, we come up with new problems, new experiences that are not well defined and not well understood. Think about that. That's where we get confused. That's where we begin to struggle. That's where we begin to have uncertainty, but that's also where we get breakthroughs. So if you consider that many times it's the things that we don't understand well that give us the opportunity to grow and learn and get better at our jobs, that's going to help you see how reflective conversations are a part of doing trauma-informed work. you remember that each skateboarder who comes to us, each survivor who comes looking for the services and expertise that we offer, has her own particular vision of her future, her own particular story, and her own particular set of resources, challenges, ideas. Each person's skateboard is configured differently and is stronger or weaker and newer or older. So my point there, of course, is that we have to be ready to learn with each new individual that we encounter. We always have to be ready to struggle, to encounter dilemmas, to encounter uncertainty, and to have breakthroughs, because there's value in self-doubt. That's what opens our doors. Now, one of the things that I'm happy about with the way Virginia is doing this day-long training, or this two-part training, is that we understand that if there's self-doubt and uncertainty, it has to be explored in an environment when you don't always have to have the right answer this minute. So there has to be space for survivors to not have the right answer and for us to not have the right answer. For us as colleagues to be able to turn to each other and say, what do you think? How can I do this? What do you know? So that self-doubt becomes an engine of learning. And out of that, as we start to look at where are our successes, what is it that we need to learn next, we start to not just construct learning, but excavate learning, because in fact, you know a huge amount about how to do your work. And you have, if you're like advocates we've encountered all over the country, you have a great deal of energy, commitment, creativity, love, all of which come together to allow you to look carefully, listen hard, and work with a survivor to find the next best thing to do, working together. So with that in mind, let's think about, okay, well, what is this reflective conversation, and what does this have to do with all of what we're talking about here? Take a look at this picture. Have you been in this situation? I'm sure most of us have, in a fitting room, doing what this young man is doing. And he could be your brother, your husband, your boyfriend, your partner, your son, your neighbor. What's he doing? What do you see? I know you've done this, most of you, if not all of you. Do they fit? Trying on something. Does this fit? Does it feel comfortable? Does it match my image of what I was hoping for? Will it allow me to look the way I want to do or function the way I want to function at the event or situation for which I'm purchasing it? In other words, trying on this new thing with questions and trying them on against some standard, if it's a standard of fit or standard of appearance or standard of style. But he's using reflection to ask, how am I doing? How's this working? And just like this young man is trying on clothes, part of what reflective conversations allow us to do is to try on ideas, strategies, understandings to see if they work. And that means we don't always have to have it right in the first moment, but that we have to use reflection. We can use reflection to think about, what is it I said this morning, to take a step or time out from the actual doing of the work to reflect on the work. There's a guy named Donald Shern, who's one of the early thinkers and writers about this reflective practice. And one of the things Donald Shern talks about is the difference between that first we learn to reflect on action. In other words, we stop and look back and reflect on it. How'd that go? And that's what we're going to talk about here and later today. And then as we get comfortable with reflecting on past actions, we learn to reflect in the moment. What am I doing now? Is this what I really want to be doing? So that we start to reflect in the moment. But we start by learning to reflect after the fact. And reflection, the folks at 0 to 3 who've done a lot of work on reflective practice in early childhood settings remind us that that reflection allows us to assess, how did I do? What made that work? I didn't know I knew how to do that. What is it I really pulled off there? And also to recognize where are our limits, where are our vulnerabilities, and I think this last point is the most important one. It allows us to make mid-course corrections, to stop and go, oh, wait, maybe I want to change this. In order to be reflective, we have to not be going, hell-bent for leather in a particular direction, dragging somebody like that first graphic slide, but rather that we are working back and forth with the survivor with whom we work in order to find what's the next best thing. What is the one next thing that's going to move towards a goal that matters to the survivor with whom we're working? All the goals in the world, if they don't matter to the survivors we're working with, are really not worth very much to the survivors. They may be worth a lot to us or to our funders or to someone else, but it's really important that we always think about what is it that we're doing for and with the partner across the room from us, sitting across the coffee table from us, the survivor and her kids, his kids with whom we're working. And this leads to how when we work with survivors, the notion of reflection also empowers them to assess their own growth. How is that going for you? What was it about that seemed like it was going to work? It's a really different question than why did you do that? What made that seem like it was the right thing to do in that moment? What piece of that worked really well for you? When has that worked really well for you? And to ask questions like, what was it about that didn't go the way you wanted it to? What do you think got in the way? What stopped it from being successful? And again, helping survivors make mid-course corrections as well. So reflection, we talk about empowerment all the time in this work. And reflection empowers survivors because then we are not the bosses, the authorities, the person with all the answers. Instead, we are working hand in hand with the survivors in order to get where they want to go. Now, again, remember I said that there are times that we have stars, goals for ourselves. It's completely legitimate to say, one of the things I have to ask everybody about is nutrition and their kids, you might say, or whatever. So I'm going to ask you that because it's part of what I'm expected to ask you. And let's see if it makes sense to you to really think about that and what we can do to make that useful for you as well. But that you own that goal as yours and not you need to think about your kids and nutrition. You hear the difference? I hope that you do. I hope that you do hear that there's a real difference when you put the survivor's experience at the center. So this is so important, the notion that saying I don't know is not an expression of weakness. Saying I don't know about something, I don't know what the right thing is to do with, for, and about a particular situation, or hearing a survivor say, I don't know, that's not something that should shut us down, but that ideally would be great. Then that's what we want. That's one of the things we want to learn. That's one of the things we want to figure out. And think how freeing that is. When you go to your supervisor and say, I don't know exactly the right thing to do in this situation. I want to know, and I wonder if you have ideas. Creates a really different kind of supervisory experience than if I don't know means I'm not doing my job right. Now, of course, you have to feel safe to do that. And a survivor has to feel safe to do that. But this is really an important piece of the reflective strategy, which is to really ask those questions in a way that opens doors to learning. So the work that we're going to do together, I really hope that we get a chance to think about some specific examples and to think about how these issues and these suggestions will work in your day-to-day work. I'm going to talk about several different versions of this reflective process as a way of thinking about how do we turn these really fairly general comments about reflection into actual action, into really things that we can do. And where I'm going to start is by taking a look at the notion that this is one version of a reflective approach. And I'm going to show you several of them. I don't have a really strong sense that any one of them is the best. But there are different ways of going about this. Generally, reflection means gathering the information, looking in the mirror, describing what you saw, describing what happened, giving enough detail to understand the context and to clarify what is it that I'm asking about. And then to ask questions, and I think we always start by reflecting individually and then reflecting with trusted colleagues before we learn to reflect with survivors. What was I, as an advocate, trying to achieve? What were the consequences? What do I feel about it? What else could I have done? And then from there, to ask, what can I learn about that? How can I do it again? How will it influence what I do in the future? So this is a kind of a general frame, helps you understand what we're talking about when we're talking about the reflective process. I sometimes use this graphic to help us think about it as a kind of cycle, because when we reflect, it's not like we go through this, gather the information, and then reflect, right? Gather the information, and then reflect, and then learn, and then we're done. In fact, it's not. It's gather the information, reflect, learn, and then once we've done that, to go back and look again. Gather new information, reflect again, learn again. We're talking about a cycle of learning. So that we start with, how did that feel? What was it that happened? What did I see? How can I describe it? To evaluate it, to analyze it and break it down, to draw conclusions, and to build an action plan. And then as we carry out the action plan, to again assess it and evaluate it and move around the circle in this way. And I'm guessing you can see my little pointer that moves around the slide. So let me start by asking you to do this. And I'm really hoping that we can work together on this. As you think about what's on your mind about your work this week or this month, and whether there's anything that you'd like help with, put those to the side for a second. I want you to start with this third question. What has gone well in your work? And just in the service of giving us a little bit more to talk about, let's take out this week and just full stop. What has gone well? Let's see if I can make a question mark. Sort of. I guess that's a question mark. What has gone well in my work? Can you think of a particular thing that when you look back on it, you think, oh yeah, that's why I do this work. This is exactly how I hoped things would go. Is there anyone who's willing to share something that you've done last week or 5 years ago that you look back on it and you think, I am so glad I had a chance to do that because it really went the way I'd hoped it would, or it went better than I hoped it would go. And I'm sure you have many, many of these things in your life. And it could be about your work life. It could even be about your life with your kids or something in your community, something that has gone well, so that we can work with this model and see how we learn from it. So we'll put on a little Jeopardy. Okay, let's use this example. The first example that's come in is that I brought an art therapist in to do some work with women in my support group. Okay, and it went well, you're saying. So let's use that as a great example to think about a reflective process. And some of you may have this handout already. And we're going to use this version of a reflective cycle to think about what made that work and why was it worth doing and what can be learned from that. And I think there's more to be learned from it than just art therapy is helpful in sexual violence programs or in domestic violence programs. And we've got a couple of other good ideas coming in as well. Okay, so when you did that, brought in an art therapist, what were you thinking and feeling? Do you mind sharing that with us? You know, what was on your mind that made that seem like it made sense? What did you see? What did you notice? And it might be, I had an art therapy class and it was useful for me and so I thought it might have been helpful. Or it might be, I saw something that one of the kids in my group drew and it made me think, well, maybe the moms could do it too. Or here, the example is a client who said, art helped me. So part of what you did, it sounds like, is lovely. One of my clients told me art had helped her, and I wanted to offer that to others. And we're going to jump on a couple of these other examples as well, but let's stick with the art therapy for the moment. So you were thinking that helped. It may have value to other people. So part of what you did was to take an experience from one survivor's story and narrative of her life and to take that in and offer it to others. What was good about the experience? And what was bad about the experience, if there was anything bad? What worked about that? How do you know it was a good thing to have done, that was satisfying? Okay, so that at the beginning, some of the survivors in your group said, well, I don't know if I can do this right. That might have made people feel really uneasy, which was an opportunity, I would imagine, to also help people find space to grow and be afraid and do something anyway. And the art therapist, it sounds like she was very good at being encouraging. What else was good about it? Are there other things that were good about the experience? Not having been there, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine, okay, so then people, it was a great way, it sounds like, for survivors to begin to explore themselves in ways that may have been safe and opened up thoughts that they might not have had before. So good things happened there, and you could analyze that. People were able to so then even though people might not have been able to talk in group, they were able to get things said and experience things that they couldn't say in language. And it's kind of a silly question, but what alternatives did you have? You had the alternative to not. Well, it's art, it's not really therapy, it's not really helpful, but it sounds like you had the courage to try this new thing. And then you can, with an action plan, ask yourself, if I did it again, how do I think it would go? What would happen and would you do this if you had the opportunity to do it again? Or how would you bring in another new kind of support for survivors in your group? Now this is very clear because it was something that was positive, but in fact when you have more time than sort of flying through something in the way that I'm doing right here, this reflective cycle is what allows you to take apart a good experience and go from, gee, we had an art therapist and it was a great idea, to actually taking the time, stepping back from the experience to reflect on it and learn from it. When I encourage people to start learning to use reflective processes, I really encourage you to start with successes of this sort. And we're going to do one more as a way of learning a little bit more about this process before we move on. Someone else has introduced the idea that, hold on, I'm just going back, a self-sufficiency program to assist clients in employment and housing and educational goals. So you brought in a new program. What were you thinking? This is a great example, again, to talk about how do you develop new resources and new responses for survivors as opposed to just doing what you already know how to do well. Was there a particular need that you saw that made you feel that this program in self-sufficiency might have been useful? Did you see something or feel something? It might have been the feeling, and I'm guessing here, but it might have been the, I don't know how to help. I don't know how to meet this need, which opens the door to trying something new. And as you think about bringing in a new program like that or trying something new in your work, you start to ask yourself, what specifically worked? What was good about it? What would I do differently? And here I think is really the critical question. What was it about it that worked so well? So that's great. So you saw that the case managers were trying to do things that they couldn't do. And rather than simply saying, oh, this is too much, survivors need more than I can give, they're too needy, which is sometimes where we might go if we don't really stop and listen. You recognize the need to do something new. And that meant thinking more deeply about what are the resources that are needed, that are available to the survivors with whom I'm working right now. The opportunity to stop and unpack what made it work, though, is so important. Can you say a little bit more about why it worked well? What was it about it that worked well? And what can you extract from that about what kinds of new programs you might want to offer in the future? Is it just we need more people, so we need somebody to do this particular thing? Or was it more than that? My guess would be that it was more than just we need to have another person to do a different part of the job. because part of what I suspect when you have these kinds of successes is that there's the success on the surface. We need a person to focus on self-sufficiency. But as you start to look under it, I suspect that it's the quality of the experience as well as just the content. So it sounds like part of what you did was not only to say we need another person to do part of the work, but to actually build new links and new resources and new liaisons in the community for individual survivors to focus on each individual part. So as you make sense of that, it teaches you how to learn, how to develop and grow and build your organization and the work that you do for survivors. Those are two really great examples that are really helpful for thinking about how you unpack successes and learn from them and share with other people and extract from them lessons that you can use in the future. So it sounds like you were getting partnerships in the community. You know, I'll bet if we had time to really unpack that, a really important part of that would be to go around this circle again with how did you get community partnerships? What were the things that said to you, we need to reach out to community partners to make this work? And that each time we hit one of those I don't know questions, that it leads to I want to know how to find landlords. I want to know how to find housing. Each time it is that unpacking that helps us build and get stronger. So I'm going to go back to the slide set. Those are great examples. Thank you so much. And have you now do something a little bit more challenging. And again, I'm going through this whole process really fast in an hour and a half. As you begin to develop these reflective and reflexive capacities, it's really the work of weeks and months and an ongoing process to become increasingly reflective in your work with individual survivors. In fact, before we go on, I want to ask if there's one more suggestion, one more example that someone can give about a success that was an individual encounter with a survivor or a survivor and family that was successful. Because we've talked about program structure, sort of structural program improvements, but can you think of a particular challenging experience with one survivor or one session that went well? And that's harder. I wonder if there's anyone who's willing to share something like that. A situation with a survivor where you thought, oh, I have no idea what to say, I have no idea what to do. And if not, I'll share one that came from my experience, but I'd certainly rather use yours. Any ideas? Okay, well, I'll tell you a story. And again, this is not from a sexual and domestic violence program. This is from work that I was doing when I was working with adults who have cognitive and developmental disabilities. And this is a particular situation. I had no idea really what to do, but I kind of made it up, and it worked. And this was a woman who had a huge amount of pain in her life and who was indeed a trauma survivor. And I later learned a lot about her trauma history. But the thing that happened was that she got very angry with someone in the house where she lived. And she picked up a little paring knife and just waving her paring knife all around, just so angry and so aggressive that everybody around her was terrified. Well, what is going to happen? What are we going to do? We have to call the police. Big, big fuss. And somehow they called me and said, help. And I had not encountered that particular situation before, but I sort of had to do something other than just let this woman continue to be afraid and out of control. And I remember going in and keeping myself at a safe distance because I didn't really want to get hurt, and just beginning to talk to her. And I will pretend that her name was Lou. And I began to say, Lou, you're really upset. What happened? Something's going on. You're really unhappy. You're really angry, and I don't know what it is, and it's really hard for me to talk to you. And to make a long story short, the thing that ended up being really helpful was when I said to her, I really want to listen, but I can't listen while I'm scared of you because you're waving the knife around. What can we do? And at that point, she gave me it was not quite that quick, but she gave me the knife. And it was a success that if you had asked me beforehand, I would have had no idea what do you do when somebody is waving a knife around and scaring everybody in sight. But fortunately, that worked. But what was important for me was not that it worked in that particular situation, that we didn't have to call the cops and we were able to help her calm down and talk about what had frightened her and made her so angry. What was useful about it was the way I got a much deeper insight how to work with angry, frightened people who did not have control over their own emotions by taking it apart, so that I would use the same kind of reflective analysis. What was I thinking and feeling? I was thinking, I'm scared, I don't want to get hurt, but I also want to stay connected with her. And it was that combination of thinking and feeling that showed me the way in to connecting with her and staying connected with me. And for me, what was good about the experience was that no one was hurt and she was not wrestled to the ground by the police and dragged off, but instead it became a healing experience both in the house and for me in my interaction with this particular woman. And as I made sense about it and asked why did it work, what I learned from that was just that it was honoring my fear and her worry at the same time that made it work. And that's, for me, the lesson that came out of the reflection about that particular situation, because the alternatives I had were that I could have, just said, well, let's figure out how to do a hold and get the knife, wrestle the knife out of her hand, and someone might have gotten hurt, and it would have been a mess. But instead, if it happened again, I would now know more about how to hold my own need and her need both solidly in my hands, in my emotional hands, in order to respond to a frightening situation in a way that kept everyone safe. So there's another example about how to work with an individual interaction with a survivor. In this case, it turns out this woman was, in fact, a trauma survivor with a long history of sexual violence before. I mean, I can't even go into that whole scary story that she had experienced, but she was a trauma survivor. Clearly, by being able to do what I did there, I was able to be more responsive to what was traumatizing for her, whatever it was that had frightened her so much, and to recognize that her reaction was a trauma reaction. It was not just, well, this is an aggressive person who's trying to hurt people. And that gave me information and taught me something about how to handle a situation like that in the future. Kate's comment is actually pretty helpful. There was both transparency and vulnerability. Oh, yeah, I was feeling really vulnerable. I really didn't want to get stuck with that knife. And it was being watchful of my own safety was just as important as wanting to be understanding of her, because if I only wanted to be understanding of her, I would have gotten too close, and I would have put her at risk of harming me, which would not have helped her at all to give her the opportunity to hurt me. And so it was by doing both pieces of that I was able to have that particularly positive outcome. I want to go back to thinking about this now, to think about a more difficult situation. I want you to think specifically about something fairly personal. I don't mean personal, something that's much more person to person than a broad organizational question. A problem, a difficulty, a situation in which you feel stuck in your work of advocacy, an interpersonal struggle with another staff person, or something else. And it could be in your work life, it could be with your teenagers at home. This helps me a lot. I have a 15-year-old stepdaughter, and I've done a lot of thinking reflectively about how to connect with this youngster and to build a relationship with her. And so this reflexive practice also works in your personal life as well. For the unpacking that we're going to do now and the use of this model, I want you to keep the content of this problem or difficulty or stuck situation private. Please don't share that with us, because that's something that we would do if we were in a more ongoing kind of consultation relationship and something that was more face-to-face. So keep the content private. But I'm hoping that there's learning that comes from a little bit of an extended exercise that we're going to do. So the first thing I want you to do is to think about something that you'd like to personally struggle with internally and learn how to use this model for something that a problem you'd like to solve. And I'm going to give you a moment, and please, when you have a particular thing in mind, please just type in yes or I have it or something of that sort. And there, that's what I was looking for. Okay, so people are starting to think about, yes, all right, I can think about the place where I'm kind of stuck. And we're going to use this guide, which is kind of detailed, but I really like it because it forces us, and not every one of these questions is relevant to every situation, but it's a way to first have a conversation with ourselves about some place where we're struggling. And we use the first column, go down the first column, and then the second column, and then the third column. So let's start by saying to yourself, and if you were doing this with colleagues, you would in a situation where you had enough time to do it carefully and you were feeling safe and connected with each other, you might do this in a staff meeting or in a conversation over coffee in the staff room with another person to think about what is the difficulty or what is the problem, what am I stuck with. Okay, so make sure you have a clear definition in mind of what it is. And if we've done this right, that may change over the course of this process, but we'll get there. Okay, so the first question then is, now that you know what the thing is that you're wanting to work on, what is your role in this? It's often very easy for us to know what the other person's role is in something that that we're struggling with. She's not listening. She's not taking my advice. I don't quite know why she's doing that. But what is it that you are doing? I'm trying really hard. I'm asking lots of questions. I'm showing my frustration. I'm not engaging as much as I want to. I'm engaging too much. Think about what it is that you're doing in the situation and then asking this next question. And this takes some real introspection. What are you trying to achieve? What is it that you're really trying to achieve? On the surface, it might be to help her meet her goals, for example. But think a little deeper. What else are you trying to achieve in this particular thing that you're struggling with? And what did I do in trying to achieve that particular outcome? What action did I take? How did I respond? And then how did the other person respond? Part of what this process does is that it slows down our thinking. Because often what we do is we jump from problem to, and what did I do to solve it, and did it work or didn't it work? And what I'm asking us to do is to really unpack that and stretch out that thinking process really very, very wide so that we have a chance to look at all of these different pieces. How did the person respond? And then what were the consequences for the survivor or for my colleague or for myself, for others, for my kid, for my family? What were the consequences? And begin to see if you can link what you were trying to achieve with the consequences for the other person. I mean, actually, I'm going to pick on my stepdaughter and take an example. I mean, anyone who has a stepkid probably has had an experience like this. I can remember early on and after I married her dad, relationship where I was trying to get her to be a particular way with me, you know, sweet and polite and always loving and wonderful, right? And at first I thought it was just to make her be a good kid. And as I looked at it more, it was also about wanting to have a vision of myself as being the best stepmother ever. And once I got to the place of realizing that it was as much about my vision of myself as it was about expectations for a young teenager, I could think about what were the consequences for her of my pushing so hard to be super stepmother, right? Why was she responding the way she was? What were the consequences for her, for myself, for my dad, for her dad, for other people that I was doing this thing in this way? And then what feelings did it invoke in her for me to do that? What feelings did it invoke in me and in other people? Really taking it apart. And once I had done that, or once you've done that with the thing that you're working on, then you start to learn things about yourself. You get clearer about what am I bringing to this. So what does this tell me? What does this teach me? What does this imply? What does this mean? Is there anyone who can share one of the findings in this box? What have you learned about yourself or about the survivor? You know, it might be that you've learned, well, the survivor really isn't interested in the thing that I think is so important. And that might be a really important insight. Are there other insights that you might have begin to look at, begin to see as you start to think about taking apart something you're struggling with? Any thoughts about that? And it might be about what it teaches you about yourself. It might be what it teaches you about the relationship that you've built with the survivor. Gee, it seems like with a relationship, which I thought was an equal relationship, now it does seem like I'm being too directive, and very directive in a way that gives the survivor not as much opportunity to speak. What does this tell me about whose idea it should be? It may tell me this person isn't feeling ready and may feel like I'm forcing her to do something that may be a great idea, but she's not ready for it. What's the model of advocacy that I'm using? As you start to unpack the things in the first column, you may see, am I being the person with the megaphone, saying, here's a great hoop for you to jump through? What are your attitudes? And someone is saying, I don't have to be the best. Sometimes it's a matter of taking a step back. Sometimes it's recognizing, I'm working harder than the survivor. You know, and when we start to have these insights, if we stop there, where's that going to leave us? Feeling, oh, God, I'm still making the same mistake. Gee, I'm just such a mess. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this work. Why am I such a... Have you ever been in that place where you start beating up on yourself for these things? That's what could happen if you stop at this square, okay? But if once you've recognized, oh, geez, there's something to see here, what was going through my mind as I was taking those steps? What was I thinking? And what did I base those actions on? Why am I working so much harder than the survivor? What's going on with me? What's going on with our program? And then you can start to ask yourself the question, what else can I bring to the situation? Remember the notion we said earlier that what is the survivor's vision of the next best step? And so it may be that if you recognize that, I'm just looking back at some of the points that you've made, if the person is not feeling ready, what happens if you bring to a conversation with the survivor, you know, I've been working so hard on the idea that it's time for you to get your GED, and it occurred to me that I should ask you whether how that sits with you. The other knowledge might be what the survivor herself has to say about it. What's your understanding? I've got a great story. I'm wondering if I have time to tell it. I'm going to tell it really quickly because it's such an interest. It just interested me. This is not my story, but it's someone I was supervising in another program, again, not in domestic and sexual violence, who's working with a family. And the short version is that there was a dad who was working with a baby, and he picked the baby up, squeezed the baby's stomach, and said, "Watch how I can make him cry." And, you know, all of us should be going, "Oh, my God, what's going on here?" Right? Feeling really frightened by that. But once the person stopped, the social worker stopped on her own and took a step back and asked, how else can I understand what this is? She came to understand that this dad believed that making babies cry to have strong lungs was really important because his father's brother drowned back in their home country trying to swim across a river. And it was a value in the family that babies should have strong lungs in order to survive, even though that wasn't conscious in the dad's awareness. That's what was going on for him when he said, watch how I can make him cry and get his lungs to be strong. I told that story very quickly because I'm trying to have you see that there's other knowledge that can help us understand when we're looking at what's going on. There are great comments coming in from all of you. Sometimes when you realize the harder I work, the more resistance I'm getting from the survivor, then if we can take a step back and stop, it's like, why is that? And what happens if you then say, you know, I've been working so hard with you, and it feels like I'm pushing you someplace you don't really want to go. Chances are she may stop, or he may stop and look at you and say, yeah. And then that's your opportunity to say, can we do this differently? What are your thoughts about that? Right? Going back to the people reaching for stars together, what do you think is something that I, the advocate, could do that would be helpful to you and your family right now? And it might be something out of left field as far as you're concerned, but that's advocacy. That's the kind of advocacy that is sharing and offering support to a survivor to make her next best step. So if we continue down the middle column here, what other knowledge can you bring to the situation? What can you do to make it better? What is your new understanding of the situation, and what broader issues come to light when you take a step back and start reflecting on what's actually going on? Because otherwise, if you keep trying and the survivor that you're working with is still saying no, 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 silently and politely, because you're the person with lots more power than she has, it's very easy for us to start to become resentful. Well, I'm just working so hard, and you'll hear people say things like, these survivors just don't care, or they just don't recognize and value how important we are and how hard we're working and so forth. And that can make us resentful, and that can make us feel empty and lost, that somehow, no matter how hard we work, we're not getting to that magical place of being super advocate. Right? Like I never was going to get to be super stepmother by trying harder and harder and harder. So the points that you guys are making are really, really helpful, and especially someone is saying here it helps accept that we can't help everyone to do what we want to do for them. I think it is absolutely right that if our vision is that a GED is the magic step to something else, and I just heard a radio show about GEDs, which is why that's in my head right now, or getting an apartment in a safe neighborhood is the most important thing because it matters to us. We may not be able to help everyone accomplish that goal, but I think we can help every single person who walks through the door to feel respected and valued. And in that sense, yes, you can help everyone. You may not be able to help everyone leave her batterer or successfully go to court to deal with the prosecution of a sexual predator, a sexual aggressor. But if what our goal is to offer each survivor the opportunity to be heard and believed, to understand that there are resources for me and I am not in this by myself, that's huge. That's enormous. And that's all you really can ever genuinely offer to someone else is the opportunity to see what's out there and to reach her hand out for the resource that makes sense to her. So I know how frustrating your work is, how frustrating it is, especially because when you see harm and you see pain, you want to fix it. If you didn't have those impulses, you'd be off someplace working at a bank or something and making big bucks. None of you are getting rich doing this work, I suspect. But we do this work because our hearts are so big and because our commitment is so strong. And finding our way to making sure that we bring that commitment and love and caring with open hands as gift is not quite the right word, but as a shared resource to someone who is directing her own life, then yeah, you can help everyone. And that, I hope, makes the job easier. Because if you don't have to help everyone reach some specific concrete goal that may not be right for that particular person, you can feel successful a lot more of the time. So that you ask yourself in the third column here, given what I've learned from this longish analysis, what do I need to do in order to make things better? What do I need to do to stop being stuck? Or to resolve the situation or improve my advocacy? What do I need to do to feel better and to get along better? And then that takes you to broader issues. And what might be the consequences if you try this new action in this new way? So I've kind of gone through this again very, very quickly, but I'm hoping that what you see here is that the conversation, can you envision yourself sitting down with a colleague and going through this about someplace where you were stuck? I'm hoping that you can see that this or some of the other frameworks for reflective conversations would give you an opportunity to learn from those I don't know places, to excavate learning from difficult situations. It's really smart to start this kind of process with something that's gone well, just to kind of get your feet wet and to learn the steps and to learn how to use this, but also to extract knowledge from successes, especially unexpected successes. But then to also do this with trusted colleagues to answer these questions about things that are hard. I think if your organizations start to work in this reflective kind of way, and it's not something that you can do just by waving a magic wand and saying, presto changeo, now we are reflective. But over time, learning to do this with survivors, with each other, with our families, with our colleagues, with the people we supervise, it gives us a different way of doing the work. And it also means harder questions can be answered. Questions about how we supervise, questions about how we relate with people who may not be the friendliest, warmest people that we encounter, how it is we deal with situations where someone doesn't understand us and what we're trying to do. So I'm hoping that a tool like this really takes you to a place that you can begin to use reflexive conversations to move your practice forward. I want to stop and ask if there are any particular questions, and then to go back to the slide set with a couple of more points that I want to make in these last few minutes. I think that question, what are their needs? You have to remember when we're asking survivors what their needs are, many times people have no clue. And that question, what are your goals, what are your needs, is a really important question, but we have to sometimes frame it in language that makes sense to the survivors that we work with. So that while, if you're working with a survivor and you say, well, what are your goals? Well, I have no idea. What are you asking me? That's a social worker question. But if you ask a question like, think about how your life is going. Can you think of the one thing that would make a difference right now? And, I sometimes joke when I'm talking, it would be, well, if I had a condo in Lincoln Park, which is a kind of shishi neighborhood in Chicago, everything would be great. Well, I can't give you a condo in Lincoln Park, but what piece of that could we maybe work on together right now? Getting a new lock on my door so that I can keep the bad guys out? I can feel safer and sleep better at night? That would be the beginning of a real conversation with someone. I want to ask that question about perfection. What would your perfect life look like is a great kind of question, but I think it may be scary to someone whose life is really painful. And I would encourage you to approach that in steps. Out of all the things in your life right now, what's the thing next that would give you a little bit of relief? And I think almost anybody can answer that question and not be scared by it. Because if you ask me what my perfect life would be like, I can think of all sorts of things, starting with no Japanese beetles in my garden and going to things that are much more important than that. But if you ask me what is the one next thing I could do, it would be to get a pair of garden gloves so I don't have to touch the bugs myself. So my example is that it may be safer and easier to start a conversation with something that's within the sights of the survivor with whom you're working right now, rather than the things that our funders and our boards tell us that we ought to do. I mean, sitting with a person and recognizing that sometimes just getting your kid to sleep through the night may be the most important thing. Oops, I think I've lost my sound. Is that any better? Sorry, I think my headset just jiggled out of place. Thank you. So I need Jen to keep me on track. So where did we lose the conversation? Let me see if we can go back a little bit. That question about whether to ask somebody, look around in your life and think, where should we, if we had a little tiny magic wand, not an enormous one that would fix everything, but we could fix one little thing, where would we turn it? And how would things be better? And what would we do next? Let's go back to this. If you were thinking with your colleague, you might ask this question, or if you were working with survivors, actually the question I'm looking for is 2 slides from here. This. Asking questions that help begin that reflective process with survivors, helping them to reflect as well, would be, what's on your mind about your life, your situation, your family right now? What's on your mind is a great opening question to an encounter, a session, a conversation with a survivor with whom you're working. And words like goals and outcomes and so forth, those are our words. Those are program words. Real world questions are, what would feel better? What would relieve your mind? What would ease things for you? And then, do you have any things that I could help with? What do you envision that the things that we have could be helpful to you? A great thing to do with survivors is to tell them, it may be really useful for you to know what some of the resources are that we have. Not this is a program list, but rather we help people with, getting a new place to live. We help people with feeling safe before they go to court, or getting things worked out to find an attorney so that they can actually sue for custody of their kids. So asking these kinds of reflective questions is a way of opening the door. Someone's saying she's going to ask her kids these questions too, and I think it really can be very helpful to ask your kids. I mean, one of my favorite questions with kids when they're not doing stuff you want them to do, it's easy to ask, why don't you? But I love the question, well, what's stopping you? And you can ask that question as well. Let's think about what's getting in your way of getting your homework done. Or let's think about what's getting in your way of getting to the TANF office in time to get the paperwork turned in, as a way of beginning to reflect and look at things rather than just naming and talking about problems. We've only got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you to think about how often we offer suggestions to people, and to think about whether there's, oh, actually, I want to go back and actually make this one other point before I do that. When we think about advocacy, oftentimes it's this second thing, offering survivors our solutions to a problem that we think is what our work is about. And certainly we need to have a whole lot of ideas and a whole lot of knowledge and resources and information at our fingertips. But I believe that our advocacy should always be working jointly with survivors on a project of their choosing. And the project might be something as simple as, to go back to a really concrete example, getting enough sleep tonight, or trying to get enough diapers so I'm not worried about running out of diapers. So a project can be something really tiny. But think about what kind of relationship you build with a survivor. I sometimes tell the story years and years ago, and this tells you how long I've been working in this field, of standing with a DV survivor in a shelter, washing diapers with her. And this is in the days before Pampers existed, where you actually had cloth diapers and you had to wash them out. In this particular instance, we had to wash them out by hand. But working jointly with her to get clean diapers for her baby was the starting point to building a relationship of trust and engagement, where what was important to her mattered more than the papers on my desk. So I really encourage you to think about advocacy in that way, and to find out from the folks you work with what's next in your view of your life. Because unless you're going to adopt her and her kids and bring them home, she's got to live her life, and she's got to set that path. So with that in mind, I want you to think that before you start making suggestions or offering a direction to someone, make sure you have questions like this available to you. Well, what are your thoughts about that? Well, I don't know, she may say. I don't know, especially if she's tired and overwhelmed, and if she's used to social workers who come and workers who come with many more ideas than the ability to listen. She may be just waiting for you to tell her what to do. So you really may have to ask, well, tell me what you've tried, and let's think about what you've tried, what pieces of that have worked. I mean, you and your kids are still breathing, so something's worked. Let's start there. What's worked in the past in a similar situation? Think how cool that conversation would be, because then the two of you are working together to get where the survivor wants to go. And suddenly you've got all sorts of energy for your job, because you're not dragging somebody uphill and you're not shouting at somebody through a megaphone. Instead, you're working together. So I urge you to remember that I don't know always points the way to I want to know. It always points the way to the opportunity to learn and uncover and direct yourself towards something new. And I'm hoping that what we've been able to accomplish today is to give you a place to start when things feel stuck, a place to start when you feel like this work is just too hard and you're going to go work in a bank. Don't work in a bank. Do this instead, and think about how you can join with survivors and they can see you as the person who took them seriously and who valued everything that they've brought to the table, that you are just one set of resources. That nice lady, she may not remember your name 10 years from now, but she probably will. But even more, is it Maya Angelou or Oprah or somebody who says, people don't remember what you do, but they remember how you make them feel? And if you make her feel strong and competent and valuable, you kind of get the energy behind her to move again. So I want you to think about where this leaves you, and we would love to get your feedback. We'd love to ask you, what do you want to know next? What do you want to learn next? And to encourage you, as some next steps, start by using either the Gibbs or the Rolfe reflective model, the two models that we looked at today, or some other models. Use them with yourself first. Use them with your partner. Use them with a trusted colleague, and then about a success in a team or group setting. Sit down with a few people and say, okay, we had this really great thing happen. We had no idea it was going to go this well. Let's see if we can figure out what we did that worked so well. And save that. We also have a tip sheet called, Jen, help me out. What is it called? The success jar is a tip sheet. I wrote it. It doesn't mean I remember it, which is a way of beginning this positive reflective process in a team setting. So try the tip jar or the success jar or some other strategy with a team or group to start unpacking successes, and then to do the same thing with difficulties in a group. But again, start with strengths before you work on struggles. And with that, I think we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to leave room for Erin and Jen to close things out. And if you want to ask a couple of questions at the end, I can stay on until we're done or until we get sent off by Jen and Erin. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for the hard, really important work that you do. Our country and our lives are made better by the kind of work that you folks do. And I really appreciate you guys for doing this, for taking the time to participate in this webinar. And Jen, I think I'm going to pass the ball to you. I think I know how to do that, or you may know how to just take it back. And thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Terry. And folks can, continue to write questions in the chat feature while I sort of verbally close us out. But I want to thank Terry Peace and the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance for such an exceptional webinar today. And especially a great thank you to Jen Curley for making sure that the webinar ran smoothly. Last but not least, we want to really thank you for spending your time with the center. Within the next week or so, I will send you all a follow-up email with the link of today's recording in addition to the handouts and the slides today that Terry referenced. At the end of the webinar, so we'll leave it open for a couple of minutes, but at the end, when we close it out, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. And if you could take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, that would be greatly appreciated. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you all have an excellent afternoon. Take care.